All right. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gridcoin Fireside here on the Gridcoin Discord server, but also streaming on the SCI, the Science Commons Initiative YouTube, and on the Gridcoin Twitter. We are trying some new production stuff. Let me throw the YouTube into the Discord channel so that anyone there can go listen there. The way this works, we've got myself, Jim, and Alex here. We're going to be talking nonsense about Gridcoin. Fun nonsense. Anyone is welcome to join the discussion. Any text chat on YouTube will get piped to us. Any text chat on Discord will get piped to us. And if you want to join with your mic, there's a link in the Discord that you can just click on, and it will bring you here up into the studio. And I'll just bring you live on stream because this is meant to be a fireside where we just have a discussion. Those of you who have been here for the first 75 episodes know exactly what's going on. It's just a little different right now. The whole point of this is hopefully we can get a little more reach because Gridcoin is moving into a new phase. Last episode, which was not uploaded yet because we did not have this production flow going, we talked about what Gridcoin is. It was a refresher for everyone. Gridcoin is this really cool thing, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot to it, but we have reached and passed several major milestones in the past year or two. Some of which include the team required removal, MRC fees, the start of a treasury through MRC fees, including stake splitting and fee splitting, the basically complete rewrite of the code. What are other big ones that I'm missing here? Integration of folding at home. These are the big things that have been done over the past year. So we now need to think about where Gridcoin goes into the future. And some of the things we've talked about, I mean, you can go back to the Fireside episodes for years and years and see what we've talked about. So there's like magnitude weighting, doing things beyond distributed computing from the protocol, figuring out how to get a currency sync with Gridcoin so that there's a little more economic stability. It's not just inflating into the ether. Those are three big ones that come to mind, but I'm sure there are lots more. So what we want to hear about from people and what we'll be talking about today, and I'm about to toss it off to Jim sort of to lead us into this, but what we want to hear from people is what direction we all think Gridcoin should go in next. What are some ideas that maybe we've forgotten about that we should start rehashing now that we have a very stable protocol with some features added? Like, I think of that. You guys remember the freaking Forkopolis when it was just struggling to survive, and now we have features added. Fun times. Okay, so that's my spiel. Also, please tell me my dog is cute, because look at that. Look at that dog. Come on. That said, I'll toss it over to Jim to take point here.
Yeah, so I think last session we did a review of essentially the basic components of Gridcoin, what the coin's for, some of the major pieces of functionality that are implemented. Today we're going to talk about some ideas. They're really beyond ideas. They're getting more well fleshed out, but about where we need to go next. One of the biggest issues that Gridcoin has is an imbalance in the economics, right? We generate, it's a classic problem that many proof of stake coins have, in that, you generate coins, but there's not a lot of ways to use them. And also in our case, because we have a 2-layer reward system. First layer is the what we call constant block reward, which was implemented a few years ago to solve some other issues with staking, which by the way resulted in it had its intended effect, the difficulty on the network. In other words, the number of people participating is very high now, so the blockchain is much more secure than it used to be. But that's layer one. Layer two in Gridcoin, which doesn't exist in a lot of other coins, and in fact the Gridcoin specific way we do it is unique to us, is our research reward systems, which pay the crunchers for their contributions to distributed computing. That is a system, we discussed quite a few details of that last week, so I won't review it other than to say that magnitude system And accrual and payment system is the second layer that's paid on top of the base staking layer. Now, the challenge we have is those coins are effectively generated, right? So during the staking process, the protocol essentially mints coins to pay people research according to the way the code is written. And basically the way the code is written is the network magnitude is fixed at 115,000. The number of research reward coins that are generated or accrued every day is 115,000 divided by 4. Exactly how much get paid out on a given day depends upon staking and MRCs and things like that, but that works out in the wash. So the bottom line is essentially the number of real GRC that we're generating every day is 115,000 divided by 4, on top of the 10 CBR per stake. Now, one of the challenges we have is, what do people do with those? Number one. Second challenge is, okay, we have more and more people joining the network. Well, that's a constant number of GRC. So the issue, as more and more people join the network and start crunching, that means each person will earn less and less GRC because the same magnitude is distributed over a larger number of contributors. So that's a challenge. So, one of the things that we're looking at in the future here to balance that out is to, and solve some other things that we want to do, is to introduce a second layer research reward system, essentially a third layer on top of the two that already exist. And the idea really is, and this is born about several different discussions we've had over the years. Jay Ringo mentioned, or John mentioned a few of them, the variable magnitude or weighted magnitude approach, some other things. What we're angling towards is to create a system where third parties, it could be projects themselves, or it could be other parties that are interested in sponsoring or contributing or paying GRC to pay contributors, crunchers. The idea is that those third parties would register a beacon, a different type of beacon, as a benefactor. And those benefactors would then charge up those a benefactor contract that would be have a certain amount of GRC assigned to it, which actually gets burned and then created as a credit in the research reward accrual system, and then would have specifications in the contract that would say what project it's rewarding and how the project is to be rewarded. And then folks with beacons would be able to sign up for specific slots in that sort of third layer, the second research reward layer. So the idea there is that it creates a sink for GRC, because for someone, a third party, to actually contribute GRC to a benefactor contract, they have to get the GRC from somewhere, which means they've got to get it on the open market, or they have to buy it from somebody who has GRC already and is willing to sell it. So that's goes a long way to solving our sink problem.
Alternatively, they could also crunch it and
they could
build up a reservoir. They could enter the system for free.
Yeah, and then crunchers can side stake to whatever address we would assign to that contract, and it would build it up that way. So there's several loops that provide a sink path for GRC, right? And so that's a wonderful thing. The other thing that does is it allows us to expand the effective number of GRC that are paid for researchers. It's not just tied to the inflation rate, right? So the inflation, remember these coins, because the coins that are done in benefactor contracts have to be purchased by somebody, or they come from somewhere. So those are not generated. Those have to already exist. And effectively what happens is, when they're injected into a benefactor contract, they get burned, and then a credit is issued in the accrual system for the same equivalent amount. So it has essentially the effect of a time lock contract, right? It takes the coins out of circulation. You can think of it as a super stake or time lock contract by the benefactor to lock that GRC up and put it to work for the network. And then that GRC is paid out as people contribute. Now, there's lots of fine print on how we're working out how these benefactor contracts are going to work, and how we're probably not going to use magnitude in the traditional sense for this third layer, because the third layer is really going to be about benefactors rewarding specific projects. And so since you're rewarding one project at a time with a benefactor contract, you really don't need to compare one project to another. So you don't really need that sort of magnitude system to sort of figure out how to add apples to oranges to pears. So a benefactor is going to make a contract on folding at home or contract on something else. They're going to know what applications are on that project, and they're going to know or have an idea how much they want to pay for a given rack rate. And so they can set a rack payment rate directly on the contract for that project without having to get into a magnitude system. So we're probably going to dispense with magnitude for this second layer.
But not completely get rid of magnitude, right? Because
no, magnitude stays.
This is all on top
magnitude
of it.
stays for the first layer.
So that's hold on. Let's start chipping away at this, because this is very dense and it's a very large. It's a whole new layer, right? It's a lot to it. So
yeah, and remember, it's on top of what's already there, so we're not going to mess with.
No replacement. To that end, first of all, I want to remind everyone this is not guaranteed to happen. This is an idea that has been being discussed, and we need people to rip holes into it and have discussions about it, improve it, and do what the Gridcoin community has done for every single other initiative that has been done on the code level, which is frankly make it better. And you don't need to be
before it gets written.
Yes,
we don't want to. Quite a bit of work to implement this next layer, so we're not going to spend the development time doing it until we're fairly certain that the community's bought into it.
Yeah, and so it's not something you need to be able to. You don't need to be a software engineer to help with this part. This is working out the logic of the layer, working out what could go right, what could go wrong, and what are the primitives of it. What are we trying to get people to do? And is what we're proposing going to get them to do what we're trying to get them to do? And to that sort of point, I think it's important we go maybe zoom out a little bit and talk about what our primary goals are and what's definitely not going to change. Like what are the main concepts? So one of the things I preach all the time is the magnitude system is beautiful in that it forces distribution of computation cycles across all projects on the network. That's great. So you can have an unsexy project get their work done while a sexy project also gets their work done. So when we're talking about building this third layer, are we getting rid of that at all?
So the answer is we're going to change it to probably, this gets into some issues around in economics called the free rider problem, and various types of cheating that people might want to try and do on an individual project basis. And so the key is there going to be to combat that, there are going to be a minimum number of participants that have to sign up to a benefactor contract for a particular project for it to be paid out at all. So there's both a minimum, but there's also a maximum. You also need to have a maximum number of slots available for a benefactor contract to limit what's called regression to non-profitability. In other words, if you don't do that, you'll end up with a crowd effect, and so many people will come in until no one's profitable anymore. That's been one of the big problems, is regression to unprofitability. There's many different aspects to it, including the fiat exchange rate, which gets into this too. But setting that aside,
you talk about we're the most stable coin out there.
We are, but the problem is, again, our problem with our first layer research reward system is more and more people come in and becomes less and less profitable over time.
Yep.
Right. So what we want, there's going to have to be limits to the number of slots that are going to be available. People are going to qualify for those slots based on their computing equipment. And the thing we're going to do to simulate or restore that sort of magnitude leveling component is the thought process is to be able to allow people to exchange slots. So if you're computing on project A, on a benefactor contract for project A, and you decide, all the slots are full on that one, and there's somebody else that wants a slot on that project and wants to give up their slot on another project, we could exchange slots. Now that's pretty complicated, We don't know if it's going to happen yet. We got to flesh that out. But we want to retain this idea of people being able to self-level, which is what the magnitude system actually accomplishes, right?
But so from what I'm hearing, we are getting rid of the inflation distribution, the protocol emissions layer.
No.
Okay,
No,
so
it's a
and
separate
that
layer. All of that still exists.
okay, and that emissions layer is
Will not
going
be
to
touched.
remain equalized.
Yes. Whether we want to
Okay.
engage in magnitude weighting, that's a whole nother discussion, but that's at layer 1. This is layer 2, which is on top of.
Because the primary goal of Gridcoin is to get computation to people who need it and not necessarily people who can pay for it. So that bottom layer will always exist where
That's correct.
you can pay infinite number of dollars to get your work done on your corporate project, but fundamental researcher who needs computation cycles will always have the protocol minting and distributing currency to the crunchers of that project.
That's correct. So layer 1 stays. Whether we want to change layer 1 or tweak it a little bit, that's a whole nother discussion, but it stays. Everything we're talking about is another layer on top of the emission layer that we have today, right? So you get to have your cake and eat it too, right? The layer 1 guarantees that a certain number of Gridcoin are going to be paid out from network protocol for any project, no matter. So these are projects that get computing effectively for free, right?
Yes.
And on top of that, you can get people that really want even more computing power. Effectively, they're going to pay for it to get people to crunch on essentially the second research layer.
It'll be interesting. So if I have a project and I pay people to go to it, and that takes crunchers from the layer 1 into mine, the layer 1 will rebalance and send people back to that one that I took crunchers from, because now there's fewer people on that project. They get more of the protocol emissed.
But there's limits to that, because the layer 1's only the generated coins, right? So depending upon how much someone wants to pay, they can still get what they want, right? And we have to explore other things that are obviously immediately come to mind. Are there limits on how much GRC will allow someone to allocate to a benefactor contract? Are there limits to the rate that will allow people to pay? Right. All those kinds of things start to come in.
Like a boost cap.
Yes, exactly right. And those are not fleshed out yet at all. We have to really explore all those different boxes, right? We're still early in this.
That's really interesting. We have a question from Nicholas in the chat. I'm going to bring it up on the screen here. So would it be something along the lines of, here is 10,000 GRC to crunch 1,000 credits on Einstein at home, and then divide it up by portion of credits?
Yes, effectively, that's right. You're establishing a rack rate, right? So you would pay out X number of credits for Y rack per day, because rack is really a daily rate, right? It's a points per day average. And so what you're basically saying is, for this amount of rack, I'm going to pay X number of Gridcoin per day out of a purse that's, V Gridcoins, right? And then that X will subtract from that V every day until it's drained, right? And so, that's the type of idea. And yet the divide up by portion of credits is right. The thought is basically linear, but there will be some modifications to that to make sure that we've solved the free rider problem, right? So, the slot limit is 1. We're not just going to allow an infinite number of people to join on these contracts. And then, we'll also have a minimum as well to pay out. The reason that we need the minimum is that this is the same sort of corner case that we have that we worry about, which is why we have the magnitude accrual limit, or the accrual limits and magnitude limits, is we're worried about what I call the hit and run cheater, right? So we don't want a single person to be able to come in and start crunching on a benefactor contract, and then maybe they're cheating. And if we allowed one person to collect all the benefactor contract stuff and then collect all that and then leave at a very high computing rate, that produces a corner case, which is difficult to control cheating wise. So if you require a minimum number of people to sign up and actually start crunching before you actually reward any GRC, it then makes any cheating essentially a collective activity, right?
Right. I'd have to make 100 sock puppets in order to cheat that or something like that.
Well, and remember, each one of those have to be beaconed. They have to be registered. I mean, we're not going to get rid of
It's
the
costly.
It's a very costly, very time consuming, very costly. And so the idea is it's not economically feasible to do it, right? So the idea is around the minimum idea is to protect against don't create an economically feasible, simple attack against the system, right? So make it hard.
I have a few questions about the contract. So you mentioned there's like a limited number of contracts. There can be, let's say, up to 12 contracts, benefactor contracts at one time on the network, or is there infinite?
There's no specific limits, at least we've thought about there. What there is a limited number of people that can link to the contract. So a contract is a contract to disperse GRC for people that are willing to compute for a particular project. What we're saying is, there will be a limit to the number of people that can attach to a benefactor contract. So if there are like 1,400 beacons right now, this contract may say, I only want 200 slots. And so you got to qualify for a slot. So the
the contract can determine, can say which type of hardware it wants in its.
Well, you can't measure hardware because hardware can be faked, but what you can measure is rack, right? Okay. So the idea is the contract allows people to sign up for a slot, and then it gives them a grace period of a few weeks. We haven't decided exactly how long for their rack to build up. And then the contract essentially ranks all the rack all the slots in the contract from top to bottom. And then, if you don't meet a certain level, it drops off the people at the bottom, right? So the idea is that it maintains a certain level of productivity per slot.
So is each contract the same, or can benefactor contracts be different? And an example of this would be, let's say I have a project that I really need to verify that there are no cheaters on this. So I will let my work get completed, but I'm not going to pay out for like 30 to 60 days after the work is completed, just so I can go verify everything.
Haven't thought through that. Although one way to handle that is through the verification end on the work unit verification, right? So you can solve that in protocol. It may be easier to solve it at the project level because, the project is in the driver's seat on when they actually verify work units. Yeah. We're still going to depend upon project verification of the work. I mean, this gets to another aspect which we've talked about a lot at Gridcoin, which is the Oracle problem. Anytime a blockchain wants to measure something outside, you have to have an Oracle, right? It's a garbage in, garbage out problem, right? So if blockchain can prove that whatever went onto it hasn't been tampered with, but the injection part is the tough part, right? How do you know that what was injected is true? And Gridcoin's version of the Oracle problem is, the projects are the ones that have to validate the work units. They were computed correctly. There's a lot of research, as folks that have been around here for a while know, on how can you do this on chain or on network. I will tell you that except for a very, very limited number of problems, it's just about impossible to use native verification of scientific work on chain. And if you do, it sort of turns into a reductio ad absurdum situation. The amount of work you have to do to verify the work units basically means you might as well do the work over again, in which case the whole distributed computing system falls apart, right? If we had to have all the nodes compute the same work unit to make sure that the network agrees that it's the same, well, that means you have effectively just one computer computing the work. So that's silly. So the answer is we're gonna have oracles forever. We have an oracle system that obviously removes the oracles themselves from a point of trust issue, right? So the oracles, because we have multiple oracles and they all issue signed statistics that can be hash verified and all that, that's the scraper system. That removes the oracle machinery as a point of trust issue. So we don't have to worry about the machinery. Still have to worry about the projects, right? Which is why we have a whitelisting approach. Quite frankly, John, I don't think we're going to be getting rid of whitelisting anytime soon.
No, it's a great aspect. We shouldn't even if we could.
I mean, I've had some people say, well, I've seen comments about, well, why don't we go the direction that Gollum went, which is, let anybody, using their API ask for something to be computed. Now, I'm not a big fan of that. I think that makes it impossible to, people could compute terrible things or garbage things.
No, there's got to be a barrier to entry.
Exactly. So I think the whitelisting is here to stay. And in fact, I think that when we go to this next layer, it's going to become even more important to make sure that, you don't have because remember, the benefactor could be the project itself, right?
That's what we're getting at. So
you can have a benefactor that's another party that wants to boost a project, or in many instances, the project itself may be a benefactor. They're willing to pay. And that's the one you got to worry about.
I think that, or be excited about. One of the things yes, also maybe worry about it. But one of the things I think this might do is bring a lot of projects online, because they'll be like, I can get the guaranteed emissions from the protocol, and I can just tap into it, and it still costs me like 1% of what it would cost me on AWS or the cluster.
That's right.
And this goes to another question from Nicholas in the chat, and I think you just answered it, but just for the sake of being sure, do the contracts have to be made by the project owners, or could I, as a random GRC user or anyone, set up a contract to supplement a project I care about? And let me expand this question a little bit. Is there a verification for benefactor contracts? Is there a process for that, or can literally anyone set up a benefactor contract?
We're still debating that. We're still debating that question.
Because one of the things this makes me think of is the verified side staking address we've talked about in the past. When side staking came out and when MRC came out, we were talking about the treasury system. How, when there's an MRC fee, there's a split between that fee is split between the treasury and whoever stakes that block that distributes the MRC to the claimant of that MRC. So the original idea in that discussion is, well, we should be able to granularly split that fee into as many, let's not go that extreme, into like a dozen different places. We should be able to split it into software development, into marketing, into outreach, into education, into science communication. We should be able to fund people, and people should be able to submit grants essentially to the system and say, hey, I want to do marketing, I want to do outreach, or even I have this research project, please help me fund my research. So what I'm seeing with the benefactor contract is a very similar thing. These might be verified side staking addresses where
no doubt about it,
people can lock GRC behind this contract, which then gets paid out based on the terms of that contract, particularly if each contract can be written independent of the other. So some contracts give APR, maybe some contracts give negative APR, something like that.
So the benefactors themselves, so I think you really have two entities there. One is the benefactor, which is a individual organization, right? It's a real thing in the world, right? Just like a CPID holder is a real person, not necessarily one-to-one, because one person can set up several CPIDs, although it's silly to do so because you don't really gain any benefit of doing that, right? Because it's rewarded linearly. So there's no Sybil attack advantage in that. And people have heard me argue, and talk ad infinitum about that. But here too, the idea is a benefactor is going to have to register a benefactor beacon, just like a researcher registers a researcher beacon. That benefactor beacon is going to be initiated from a private key, public key combination, just like the benefactor beacon will have an address associated with it. We could also create additional addresses for benefactor contracts that would allow people to pay money against those contracts, right? And so one way to chain this would be to allow if we allow a third party not related to a project, or we could include the public key of the project they're trying to do in the contract they're issuing, which can have a separate key and a separate address to be paid. And so we can do everything you're talking about. The question is how how flexible we want to make it. I'm not sure entirely yet, but certainly that also affords us to be able to do side staking, that sort of flow immediately. I mean, even before we put side staking, automatic side staking in, people could even just put that address as a side staking entry, just like they do today, right? That doesn't require any change whatsoever.
And
Go ahead,
go ahead.
Alex.
as I say, one benefit of enabling any kind of person to either add GRC to a contract or to make their own contract for a project that they support is it gives us a good avenue for projects to promote Gridcoin, right? So if you're a Boink project, if you're Rosetta at home, and you're on the whitelist, you get a certain amount of crunching power from that, 1 over 12 or however many projects there are. But if you want to crunch more data or you want to get the data crunched faster, you of course could have, you could ask people for donations, you could buy servers. There's a lot of overhead you could invest in doing that. But you could also just say, hey, buy GRC, throw it out of our contract. If you support this project, here's a way to support it monetarily in a direct and immediate fashion that doesn't require that kind of large infrastructure investment.
Yep. And I don't know, going back to that other question just came up, I'm not sure yet whether we want to, I'm not sure what we may want to do is have the benefactor control the parameters of the contract so they really can't be changed. So the benefactor controls the parameters, but allow other people to charge that contract up if they want, so they could contribute to it. They wouldn't be able to change the parameters of the contract other than just injecting additional money into it. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
frankly, I like a whitelisting process for benefactors themselves. Like we can have, let's say, 50 whitelisted
That's right.
benefactor contracts, and the network has to vote on your contract before it goes in. So that incentivizes the network to look for shitty contracts, and it incentivizes people. It puts that indirect incentive for education in there again.
Well, that would be the benefactor version of beacon verification, right? In the individual researcher beacon's case, the verification proves that they actually have an account on Boink, right? And that the CPID is theirs. Here, we don't really have a corresponding analog, but the analog would be that the network has to sign off and approve on a benefactor coming into the system, right?
Yeah, and it gives value to a benefactor contract. You can't just spam contracts. Maybe we even use benefactor contract creation to implement another type of small fee to even prevent that further. But if we have a whitelisting process, I don't know why we need an anti-spam fee. But instinctually, I like whitelisting benefactors and having a limit to the number of contracts.
Me too. In fact, Div72 and I anticipated something like this coming up, which is why we put a public key field in the project structure, anticipating that we thought of the first version of this, which is the degenerate version, which is the project themselves are a benefactor, right? So that particular subversion or subset of what we're talking about, where the project itself is a benefactor, is already sort of, there's some structures already in the code ready to do that, because effectively the project can record the public key of a person that has the private key that corresponds to the benefactor, and then that sort of heads into the beacon direction, right? So they create a benefactor beacon when we whitelist a project. In fact, I would argue that probably what we should do as part of a project whitelisting is that we should allow the project administrator the option of also at the same time qualifying for a benefactor, so that when you do the whitelisting vote, it's double-ended, right? Not only do you whitelist the project itself, but it also whitelists them as a benefactor beacon at the same time, which allows them to create a second layer contract on top of the normal.
This is so interesting. So we can play with this. Okay, this might be very stupid. We could make another type of contract, which is a meta benefactor contract. So essentially you have, assume we do what you just described. Every whitelisted project gets a benefactor contract, or at least a choice of. So let's say we have 20 whitelisted projects. We're guaranteed 20 benefactor contracts. The total number of benefactor contracts on top of that is dependent on this third contract that people just donate GRC to, and it's burned forever. It's never redistributed or anything, but it has to reach certain thresholds to unlock more possible benefactor contracts. So the network has to decide that it wants more benefactor contracts, and the way it does that is put money into
Yep.
a contract.
Yeah, that's another idea that's really good too. I mean, this is the kind of discussion that we really need to have before we start putting code on paper in the computer, right? Because there's, first of all, we got to get comfortable with the basic ideas that we're talking about, right? Which is how do we build a contribution reward network that's got balanced economic flows. And then once we're familiar and comfortable with those ideas, talk about the pluses and minuses of different things that we want to do, right?
Yep. Like the less degen way to do that is just like make a static formula, like 2x plus 1, and that's the number of benefactors, 41 you would have there. But
yeah, we want to try and keep the rules pretty simple.
Yeah, at least in the beginning, right?
Yeah, well, even beyond that, because I think what happens, even our magnitude system befuddles people. We get.
But its outcome is so simple and so easy to explain.
It is, but it's amazing when and I'm sure you've seen this in the help section. We answer the same questions like 10 times a day for new people.
Well,
they just
standard GRC shout out. Come help us with documentation, guys.
Yeah, RTFM doesn't seem to work too well, and you point people. Did you go read the super block section? Did you go read the magnitude section? And of course, people don't RTFM, and they come in with zero knowledge. I know that Alex has talked about, well, how do he wants to rewrite the documentation to sort of cover the most common blue sky path as a straight path. And sort of, because right now the documentation is set up sort of hazy with a lot of choices and byways and pathways. And then as a result of that, what happens is that people get confused. We think it's because we want to show them all options and show how flexible, and they have this and they have that. And it ends up in what's called the supermarket effect, right? People walk in there and they see 50 different flavors of spaghetti sauce, and they're just befuddled. Which one should I get? The Newman's Own marinara or the?
I had this exact experience the other day.
Right.
There's way too many sauces.
Well, that's the problem. We've created in our documentation. We've created too many choices, too many pathways, and we think that it's all clear. It's not. It's as clear as mud to people.
No, you're absolutely right. We wrote it for power users, and most people are not power users.
By the time you get a power user, you don't need it anymore.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, by the time you get to a point of like me, I don't even know where people are getting the hangups anymore because I've been around so long. Stuff that just seems to be, like, why would you get confused over that? Well, the answer is I've been doing this I'm the lead technical developer. I've been doing it forever. So things that are absolutely clear to me are totally unclear to other people. And so it's hard for people that have been around a long time to maintain perspective over what people that are just coming in see. And that's why we've got to there's got to be a certain amount of complexity to cover these corner cases, because we definitely have to deal with possible cheating problems and setting up the network to avoid the free rider problems. We're trying to get to a place of economic stability and a place where, we don't have a reduction to basically the march to zero if you have an infinite number of researchers and things like that. So we're trying to address all those things, but we also want to do it in the simplest way that we can so that this thing doesn't become inscrutable, right? But anyway.
So I have two questions for you, Jamie, if I can do two.
Yeah.
The first one is, I think we kind of, just to conceptualize how this might work, we've talked about who might want to buy these contracts, right? Obviously, a project might want to further incentivize their own crunchers, or people who support a project may want to throw more GRC onto that project and incentivize more crunching. Who are the other kind of third parties who would need? What are some examples of problems that large computation is needed for that might want to use this third layer?
Well, I think companies, look, you answered it yourself. I think companies themselves spend a lot of money on R&D, right? And what we're looking for, and again, this goes back to the slot limit question too. We're looking for what's called a triple win. We're looking for the ability for certain types of problems, and it's got to be a massively parallel problem that lends itself to distributed computing. But there are lots of those problems. And again, with our whitelisting requirement, it can't be any old problem. So the network's going to have to buy off on what's being done. So that's an aspect to it. But, companies that want to solve certain scientific problems in R&D, their goal is to be able to give it to the Gridcoin network and pay less money to the Gridcoin crunchers than they would have paid if they did it themselves with their own R&D department with Amazon AWS. That goes back to John's comment, right? The second part of that inequality we need to satisfy, which we don't have to do it now in the first layer, because for the first layer, most people are participating in Gridcoin not because they necessarily want to make a profit, but because they would have been crunching anyway. And so whether they make a profit or they're making a loss, Gridcoin's a little cherry on top to scientific computing work they've been doing. So I fall in that category. I was a BOINC contributor long before I came along the Gridcoin scene. I started this in 1999, July of 1999. That's how long I've been doing distributed computing. A long effing time. Okay. Gridcoin is as old as Gridcoin is. It ain't that old. And so a lot of people that are old timers in the Gridcoin network are not doing it for profitability per se. Other people would like to make or eke out some sort of a return. What that means is a good question. But the idea is that if you can achieve a triple win, which is the benefactor pays less to the network than they would have to pay to do it privately, and then the crunchers, when they crunch on that, make more in terms of the value of GRC given to them than they pay in terms of power or machine, right? So that's the triple inequality where one is greater than the other, which is greater than the other. So you get a return out of each level. That's the ideal situation. And I see companies that want to deal with certain types of problems. I think quite frankly, institutions may get involved of different types. And certainly, one of the challenges I think we have is a lot of these projects that we have now are great, but they're kind of nichey. Some of them are a little bit backwater niche-ish. I think if we had the ability to really incentivize contribution and people knew that it was coming from someone who paid more GRC, quite a bit more GRC, I think if that was properly announced, it would result in a lot more participation in the network, which becomes a virtuous cycle. So I think you've got all of that. You've got different entities that would want to do this. Independent research arms, whether it's universities or whatever, companies themselves, which could be involved in scientific research, or even tech companies that want to solve certain types of problems.
Let me add to this too. So like one of the main visions of Gridcoin, right, is to make it so that greedy people in their greed and their quest for money do science. That's their outcome.
That's right.
And that is a world that a lot of people can get behind, because all right, you're a greedy bastard, fine, you're making the world a better place for everyone. That's fantastic. So what this could do is, in order for that to work, Gridcoin needs to be profitable. You need to make more by crunching than you do power-wise. But we could also see people who aren't even using distributed computing sign up for these benefactor contracts. We could see researchers maybe create benefactor contracts and doing fringe research or even mainstream research that's just not funded well enough to get funding through the normal traditional avenues, and they can come through Gridcoin and get funding through a benefactor contract.
And by the way, this actually interoperates quite well with the microgrid concept too.
Yep. So I think this opens Gridcoin up to even more avenues of utility beyond distributed computing that could be better funding mechanisms than some of the other things that are coming up in DeSci, because it's ruled by a little more stability than just a random subset of people with a bunch of pre-minted tokens distributing them. There's a lot of potential to benefactor contracts.
So that's right, John. I mean that's the long and short of it. There's a lot of hastiness and questions that still remain about it. It's early in this, but I think we're headed in the right direction. And I think I made the comment in the last session that Gridcoin has to make a choice of what it is. There are other coins and other initiatives out there that are dealing with let's call it the document end of things, right? Which is storing research, doing sort of the hive version of scientific research, right? How do you store documents, access documents, have open science? To me, I don't think that's where Gridcoin needs to play. I think we need to play on the other end of it, which is the computing part that we're talking about, right? And we'll plug into that other stuff. At some point, who knows, there may be atomic swaps between us and Filecoin or somebody else to sort of meld the two together or something. I don't know, but I think we should concentrate on the distributed computing economic end of it, which is getting the computing done to produce the research papers, and then we leave it to other organizations to actually deal with storing those research papers and distributing them and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
I'm building on top of that.
Yeah.
So I absolutely think that is a layer that should never disappear. But I think there is room to build a funding mechanism. Essentially, let's fund actual research. So there's a bunch of DAOs that do this, and that research might not need computation, but it could, like, who knows how this granularly is implemented. But for example, you have like OpenZika, which started as a computational project and has transitioned into the wet lab. We could have funded that entire process, starting from just someone doing chemical simulations in a computer to we found 5 compounds we actually want to test. And that's not computational, that testing. We just need to pay someone's salary. So we can make a benefactor contract that pays for that person to do this work. It sounds super interesting to me.
By the way, one other corner case that I wanted to mention, and Alex, I know you were about to. So going back to the microgrid concept, we can have the reverse flow occur, which is another version of something. Somebody else brought this up earlier, and I answered it. We could have someone that wants to set up work units on microgrid sign up as a benefactor, but put no GRC on it, but instead ask for third parties to contribute or donate to that benefactor contract, which then reverses the flow in the other direction. So not only do they get the free layer, which is layer 1, the magnitude layer, but they could actually, if they could get people to donate to that contract, it would direct even more computing power to small projects or, with limited applications and limited infrastructure, with other people donating the money, right? So there's doing this benefactor contracting this way. There's all sorts of things that you can do to motivate and incentivize people to do things that we've been talking about for years, quite frankly, and just haven't been able to do, right? So,
that's
John,
awesome.
Alex, you were going to say something too.
Just the second question I had for you was, how do you see the relationship between this benefactor proposal you're talking about now and the previous kind of proposals for solving the GRC sync problem, like the green paper or green list or what have you? Is this like an extension of that? Is this a separate thing?
Yeah, it is. I see this as like the green list sort of developed with a thought towards making it real, right? So I think this, if you read that green list and start thinking carefully about the problems that ensue when you try and do that, you sort of arrive at this place that we're at with these benefactor contracts, right? So effectively, this is kind of like the next evolution of thinking along those lines is the way I look at it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to piggyback off something Jay Ringo said, which I think is fascinating, is that because you were talking about earlier about how we want Gridcoin to be the blockchain for scientific computing, right? There's other coins that are working on the paper and documentation storage end of it, and there are going to be other coins in DeSci working on other aspects of the scientific process that maybe we link into or maybe we don't. But Jay Ringo's point that for the OpenZika project, only one stage of that entire project is computationally related. But there's no reason in theory that we can't also fund other parts of that process if we have the right infrastructure in place for it. My thinking is, for example, let's say that a benefactor contract is set up for the second stage of OpenZika, which is the wet lab testing, right? But of course, wet lab testing doesn't result in RAC, so it would have to be rewarded in some other way. But we have the mechanism currently to whitelist projects. Could we also have a mechanism to dispense the GRC from the benefactor contract? The example being,
I think so. I mean,
like someone completes the wet lab work and they say, I did it. And then the network votes, yes, you did. And now that GRC gets dispensed.
Because that's a form of a scoreboard.
Right, exactly.
So any thing that we could cook up that could be scoreboarded, where we could measure. Number one, develop a measurement standard. What is that? What does it mean to complete work? I'm not talking about outside the DC case, but like you're talking about, very abstractly. Okay, what does that mean? And then provide a measuring unit, and then pay out of the benefactor contract based on that. So this is very, very general and very abstract, right? But yes, we could do that.
And there's so much potential there, because just so much research is, even if it's not primarily computational, is going to have computation processes in it moving forward as we get more and more into the digital era, et cetera. So it's almost like every piece of research will have a computational phase in it, and we can fund that through a benefactor contract, use our crunchers to get that research done, and then continue that relationship with that project, with that institution, through another step of the benefactor contract that's not dependent on computation cycles. And that just seems like there's so much there to unpack.
There is.
I think there's a lot of potential here. There is also another question from the chat coming from Nicholas. Great questions. Thank you. Can the contracts be specific enough to pay out for a sub-project of a project? I'm mainly thinking of microgrid, but any project with very specific sub-projects would be affected. And I'll expand that even to just like the application in a project. So like PrimeGrid has like 4 different applications running at the same time. Like, how granular can you get?
So right now, no, because the statistics infrastructure is not granular enough on it. In theory, yes. It all is how granular you want to get on what statistics you're reporting, right? So the BOINC scoreboard doesn't get down to application level rack, right? So the rack is in the user file is presented as it's all mushed together. So you don't know from the BOINC statistics files how much each application is contributing to the rack rate. There's a way to get it, but it involves, you can't get it out of the normal statistics files. And so, that poses a challenge. Now, in theory, if we wanted to go down changing the format of the statistics and introducing additional changes to BOINC to improve the granularity of statistics reporting, then the answer is we could do it. So,
this raises another question then. Is this something we can build without any changes to BOINC at all?
No.
Okay.
Oh, the benefactor contract, yes.
Sorry, that's what I meant. What I meant. Just
so
the benefactor
answer
contract.
Is yes. But if we want to do what this person asked, no.
The granular aspect, no. But okay, so this also goes to what Alex was saying before, like comparison to other sort of brainstormed ideas about how to make a sync. Some of them really required like brand new ways to measure compute, magnitude weighting contracts, which change the protocol that Gridcoin relies on, which is kind of risky. This one seems like it's exactly as you describe. Everything below it stays exactly as it is, and we just build a new layer on top.
And you have to recognize the limits, right? So this is an example of something you can't do with the underlying machinery not disturbed, right? So you can't award different rates on different applications of a single project because we don't have statistics at that granular level, right? But setting that aside, everything else we're talking about with benefactor stuff, the underlying Oracle machinery and statistics machinery doesn't have to be changed, which is a good thing. That helps immensely in terms of getting this done. I for one don't have it in me to do another Fern / not alone anyway.
I wouldn't want to see you do it.
But I think with a couple of folks, 2 or 3 people working on this next layer, constraining it just to the superstructure above, using the existing rack capabilities and all that kind of things that we already have undisturbed, we can do it. And by the way, it's going to take a while. I mean, John, we've talked, obviously on the SCI side, we're working with the main BOINC developer, and we're trying to work on, how do we sort of get BOINC in a place where we renovate it some, right? So, those are longer term things, but I have a feeling eventually we're going to want to change things in the machinery there to do better reporting. better statistics and things like that. And then that will flow into this. But my guess is it won't be initially. Alex, you were going to say something, I think.
Yeah, just a question on the benefactor contracts. My understanding of it is that essentially you would lock up this GRC and award it to crunchers based on rack. And that would be in the example that you have a certain set of work to get completed, and when the work is completed, that's when the award goes out. But what if you have if my understanding is correct, what if you have an ongoing need for work, or is that accounted for in the system as well? Like
it's just like so if it's ongoing need for work, you're remember normally BOINC, obviously there's some work units that take a week to get done, right? And then you have CPDN, which is a totally different animal, which by the way is not on the whitelist because they can't report their statistics often enough. But most BOINC projects chop the work up into small enough units that, you're getting rewarded credit for each one of those. And so what's really going on is your rack is based on validated work units that have been measured by the project, right? So what really is happening there is a project that wants to reward ongoing work. They chop that ongoing work up into many work units and then distribute them out to people, and then the people's rack goes up, and then they get paid that way. I mean, that's how it works today in the first layer. Really don't see it much different for the second layer.
Right. So, but in this, you set up the benefactor contract, you put a bunch of GRC in there, a bunch of crunchers start crunching on it. And then, but there's a single point of disbursement as opposed to the magnitude system where it's kind of constantly dispersing each day. Or am I misunderstanding
No, so what happened, what's going to happen, you are a little bit. So what's really going to happen is, and this makes the accrual system more complicated. What really happens is the accrual system is going to have to make an association between people who've signed up for a slot on a benefactor contract, which is a researcher, and the benefactor contract. The benefactor contract has a credit in it. And it also has a payment rate, right? Based on this rack, on this project, I'm going to pay out this amount of GRC. That payment is not a real GRC payment. What really is going to happen is the GRC is accrued GRC. Remember, it's credits. So when you charge a benefactor contract, the charger of the benefactor contract, the benefactor themselves, or a contributor to the benefactor contract, will donate GRC to that benefactor contract. Notice I use the word donate. That GRC is going to get burned immediately. A credit will be issued to the benefactor contract, which will be recorded in the accrual system. When the rack in the super block is computed, what happens is that rack rate for that project, for each beaconed researcher that's tied to a slot in that benefactor contract on a daily basis or in a real-time basis, as the GRC accrues on the researcher side, it's going to be drained away in real time from the benefactor contract side. So what happens is you can think of it as like literally a credit debit, like an accounting system, right? So that money is literally going to move instantaneously on a real-time basis from the benefactor pool to the researcher pools. It's really not moving. What really is happening is the accrual system just on a real-time basis figures out the position where we are.
Gotcha.
Just like the research system today figures out the pending rewards. That's a virtual accrual in the sense that the system really computes in real time what you're owed.
So this brings up an interesting thought, I think. Based on some metrics that we determine, would it be possible then to say, hey, the benefactor system, the benefactor layer is monopolizing the network on a single project or two? So moving forward until this is rebalanced, every GRC submitted to this, burned in this contract, instead of issuing one credit, will issue half a credit, will issue a quarter of credit. So kind of disincentivize people from going there and try to rebalance the network. And that's something that eventually could be automated.
Yeah, we have to talk about that. I mean, really effectively, if you're not using magnitudes, you have to talk about adjusting these rack rates, right? In other words, how much are you going to pay in GRC per day, or reduced to a real-time unit per second? How much GRC are you going to pay a person for a certain amount of rack on a certain project in a benefactor contract? And should those be adjusted?
This brings up another freaking magnitude unit, because I also like the idea. Well, first of all, in order to do that, that would have to be a protocol defined sort of thing. That's not a granular contract. But I also like the idea of having independent granular contracts where each contract can be a little different. One might do something like an APR system. One might do some interesting time lock stuff. So like interesting financial mechanisms in each contract. So I guess would it be possible to combine both of those where there is a global protocol variable in each contract that the protocol can adjust based on the metrics we determine?
Yes,
And then
because at the end of the day, and you'll see this in Will's paper, at the end of the day, you can compute a master payment rate because once you establish, okay, here's my initial value, how much I'm going to pay in GRC per day per rack unit, which sounds like magnitude, right? A little bit. Once you do that, you'll have that for each one of the benefactor contracts. You can then do adjustments to those if the overall payment rate in the network is too large or it's tilted towards too much towards one project. The system's going to know it because it's going to have to compute all that stuff in real time anyway.
This is really cool. This gives us new measurements to determine use of the network. It gives us a new way to get people to crunch different stuff. It gives us a sync. It gives us a new fee mechanism, perhaps.
No one better talk to me when we get to work on the accrual system for this, because we're going to be a raging lunatic when we go code it, because the accrual system as it exists is complicated enough. This is going to add several more dimensions to it to get it right.
Yeah, you keep bringing it up. I don't think I understand the accrual system. Over all these years, I don't think I've ever dove into that, and we're not going to go into it now.
Well, why don't we talk about that the next one? So I'll spend 10 minutes talking about what does that pending reward field mean on the front screen that everyone always asks about. How does that work exactly? Well, and there's the oracles, the scrapers, there's the super blocks, right? And then there's that crazy accrual folder. If you go look in the data folder, in the data directory for Gridcoin, you'll see an accrual folder, and there's a bunch of files in there that look like they have numbers that look like block heights, and that's exactly what they are. And we'll talk about all that and how it all works, because it's pretty cool.
That would be awesome, and how it ties, how benefactor contracts will tie into that,
and how they're going to make it more complicated to do it.
Yeah, because that's where I start to get lost, I think.
Yep. Because remember, we don't have to compute a credit and drain side right now, because the accrual is coming from generated coins. We make the coins up out of thin air, right? So it's a one-sided accounting system. It's the government printing money or printing GRC, so we don't have to deal with the debit side, right?
Hey, our government has been printing the same number of GRC every day for 10 years.
That's right. Hey, our Gridcoin is a lot better in the inflation rate than a lot of them. We're actually pretty low. But therein also becomes the problem when we want a lot more people to join the network too.
Yep.
Well, we're over. This was a great session today, I think. So.
Absolutely. So people, here's the ask for you. Think about this. Think of questions, concerns, poke holes in it, figure out ways it will blow up, or think about crazy ideas that might sound stupid, but are probably actually pretty cool. And that said, we'll be back in 2 weeks. That's March 7th, Tuesday, 4 p.m. Eastern on the Gridcoin Discord server, the SCI YouTube. Thank you, Science Commons Initiative, for letting us use your YouTube, and on the Gridcoin Twitter. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.